Welcome to The Explainer. So, what if I told you there's a plan out there to slash UK government spending? Not by a little, but by over £100 billion. Well, today, we're digging into a pretty detailed report from the think tank Policy Exchange that lays out exactly how that could happen.
So the report kicks off with this pretty stark warning from Sir Robert Choate, no less, the former head of the UK's fiscal watchdog. He actually calls the ideas unpalatable. That tells you right away that these proposals are going to be controversial, to say the least. But the authors, they believe they're absolutely essential.
Okay, so what's the big problem this report is trying to solve? Well, according to its authors, the UK is caught in what they call a twin-pronged crisis. Basically, two major economic headaches happening at the exact same time.
And here they are, the two sides of that crisis. On one hand, you've got this massive ball and chain, public debt. And on the other, a government that's spending and taxing at near record levels. The whole argument of the report is that you just can't solve one without tackling the other.
Okay, first up, let's talk about the debt. The sheer scale of it is what they call inordinately high. It's sitting at around 100% of the entire country's annual economic output. To put that in perspective, that's a level the UK hasn't had to deal with for over 60 years.
And then there's the second problem, spending. Right now, the government is spending about 45 pence of every single pound the UK economy produces. The report's take is that this is the direct cause of a tax burden so high it's actually stifling economic growth.
All right, so if that's the diagnosis of the crisis, what's the prescription? Well, let me tell you, the report doesn't recommend just a few minor tweaks. Nope. It calls for a radical, multi-billion-pound reduction in government spending.
And the headline number is pretty staggering. We're talking about a plan to cut public spending by £115 billion every single year by 2030. Just to give you a sense of scale, that's more than the UK's entire annual defense budget. It's huge.
So, what's the big idea here? The theory behind all this is to create what they call a virtuous circle. It goes like this. You show some serious fiscal discipline. That reassures financial markets, which then lowers the interest rates the government has to pay on its debt, which in turn saves even more money and builds even more confidence. See? A virtuous circle. Okay, but the big question is, where would a cut of £115 billion actually come from? This isn't about, trimming a little bit from every department. The plan really zeroes in on two massive areas, welfare and pensions. Get this. Together, they make up nearly half of all the proposed savings.
All right, so let's really drill down into those two areas. Because the proposed reforms to pensions and welfare, they are the absolute cornerstone of this entire plan. We're talking about almost half of the whole $115 billion in cuts right there.
So for pensions, the plan is basically a three-punch combo. First, a 3-year freeze, no increases at all. Second, they'd permanently scrap the triple lock, which, as you might know, is a really popular policy that guarantees generous pension increases. And finally, any future rises would only be linked to inflation. That could potentially end the whole era of above-inflation pension growth for good.
And just when you thought that was it, the pension reforms don't stop there. The report also proposes making people wait even longer to get their state pension, pushing the retirement age all the way up to 70 by the year 2040.
Now, moving on to welfare, the proposals kind of follow a similar logic. They're calling for a freeze on most payments for 3 years and, at the same time, tightening up the rules on who is actually eligible. The stated goal here? To reverse that sharp, post-pandemic rise in the number of people claiming benefits.
Okay, so pensions and welfare are definitely the biggest targets, but this plan goes so much wider than that. It's really calling for a fundamental rethink of what the government should even be involved in at all.
Just look at the sheer breadth of these proposals. They pretty much touch every part of public life. We're talking about introducing charges for things that have always been free, like going to see your GP, to slashing green energy subsidies, and totally redesigning the entire childcare system. Nothing is off the table here.
And underpinning all of these specific cuts is one core philosophical idea. The report argues for a complete flip in how we think about this. The default shouldn't be, can the private sector do this? Instead, it should be, is there a truly compelling reason why the government must do this? It's a big shift in perspective.
All right, now let's get to the elephant in the room. The report directly addresses the big, obvious question hanging over all of this. Could any government ever actually get elected or, stay in power while trying to implement a plan like this?
And their answer to that charge, the idea that this is all politically impossible, is pretty simple. They say history shows that's just not true. They argue, we've seen this movie before, and it doesn't always end how you'd think.
Specifically, they point to two key periods in recent history: the Thatcher governments back in the 1980s and the coalition and conservative governments in the 2010s. In both of those cases, public spending was significantly cut as a share of the economy. And here's the crucial point the report makes: the governments responsible for those cuts went on to win re-election.
So the report wraps up with what it calls a four-part recipe for success. It says any leader who wants to attempt something like this needs, first, to really understand the problem and actually want to tackle it. Second, they need a practical plan, like the one they've laid out. Third, they have to muster the raw political will to see it through, no matter how tough it gets. And fourth, and this is maybe the hardest part, they have to persuade the voters to come along for the ride.
And so the report leaves us with this final challenge. It frames this whole detailed economic plan not as some dry technical exercise, but as a direct test of the country's political leadership. The path is laid out. The ultimate question, it suggests, is not whether it can be done, but whether anyone out there has the will to actually do it.